She stood in the doorway of their bedroom at 2:47 a.m., her hands trembling as she held the phone. On the screen was a message that would either destroy everything they'd built over 23 years, or save it. The choice she made in that moment, the lie she told, would haunt her for the next 6 months. But here's what nobody saw coming: that lie, that terrible, beautiful lie, would become the most honest thing she'd ever done. Margaret Hayes was 52 years old when her marriage cracked wide open. Not with shouting or broken dishes, but with silence. The kind of silence that settles between two people who've stopped seeing each other, even when they're in the same room. Her husband David, 55, worked 60-hour weeks at an accounting firm downtown. She managed a small bookstore on Camden Street, the kind with creaky floors and the smell of old paper that reminded people of simpler times. They had 2 grown children, a mortgage nearly paid off, and a routine so predictable you could set your watch by it. Wednesday nights were always pasta. Saturday mornings, David golfed while Margaret reorganized the store's mystery section. Sunday evenings, they watched whatever was trending on streaming services, sitting on opposite ends of their leather couch. To everyone else, they looked fine. Stable. Content. But what happens when contentment becomes a cage? When the life you've built starts to feel like a museum of who you used to be? And what would you do if you discovered that the person sleeping next to you every night had been living a completely different life? 23 years earlier, Margaret and David had met at a community college theater production. She was painting sets, he was managing the budget, neither of them were performers, but they both loved being part of creating something. Their first conversation happened over paint-stained coffee cups at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, arguing about whether the forest backdrop needed more shadows. He thought she was brilliant. She thought he was careful in a way that made her feel safe. 6 months later, they were engaged. Their wedding was small, held in her parents' backyard with white folding chairs and her aunt's famous lemon cake. They honeymooned at a bed and breakfast 3 hours north, where it rained the entire weekend and they didn't care at all. The first decade was good. Really good. They learned each other's rhythms, finished each other's sentences, built a language only they understood. When their daughter Emma was born, David cried in the hospital hallway for 20 minutes straight. When their son Tyler came 3 years later, Margaret watched her husband rock that baby at 3 a.m. and thought, this is what love looks like. But somewhere between Tyler's high school graduation and the empty nest that followed, they drifted. Not dramatically. Not even noticeably at first. It started with David taking extra projects at work, coming home later, eating dinner in front of his laptop. Margaret threw herself into the bookstore, hosting reading clubs and staying late to do inventory she could have finished in half the time. They stopped asking each other about their days. Stopped making plans that weren't obligations. Stopped touching except in passing, a hand on a shoulder, a brief kiss goodbye that landed somewhere near a cheek. By their 23rd anniversary, they'd had sex twice in 14 months. Both times felt like a chore they were checking off a list. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, we'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. It was a Monday in late September when Margaret's world tilted. She'd come home early from the bookstore, a migraine pressing behind her eyes, and found David's laptop open on the kitchen table. He was upstairs in the shower. She wasn't snooping, not really. She just glanced at the screen while reaching for her water bottle. What she saw made her stomach drop. An email. Not to another woman, which somehow would have made more sense to her in that moment. It was to a real estate agent in Colorado. David had been looking at properties. Small cabins near Boulder. Places with 1 bedroom, maybe 2. The most recent email, sent that morning, read, I'm interested in scheduling a viewing for the property on Pinewood Trail. My timeline is flexible, but I'm hoping to make a decision by November. I'll be traveling alone. Margaret's hands went numb. She stood there, staring at those 2 words, as the shower shut off upstairs. Traveling alone. November was 6 weeks away. She clicked through the email chain, her heart hammering. He'd been corresponding with this agent for 3 months. Looking at properties. Asking about schools in the area, even though their kids were grown. Asking about the community, the winters, the distance from the nearest airport. He was planning to leave. That's all her brain could process. He was planning to leave, and he hadn't said a word. When David came downstairs 15 minutes later, hair damp and wearing his reading glasses, Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop closed in front of her. Hey, he'd been waiting for this moment and was almost glad it had arrived. Margaret, I was going to tell you, he said quietly. When? Her voice cracked. When you'd already bought the place. When you'd already left. He sat down across from her, and for the first time in months, she really looked at him. There were new lines around his eyes. Gray she hadn't noticed creeping into his sideburns. When had they both gotten so much older? What followed was the most honest conversation they'd had in 5 years, and it was devastating. David didn't raise his voice. Neither did she. That somehow made it worse. He told her he felt invisible. That coming home felt like walking into a house where someone had already turned off all the lights. That he'd started dreaming about a different life, something smaller and simpler, where he didn't have to be the responsible one all the time. Where he could wake up and not immediately think about deadlines and bills and all the ways he'd disappointed himself. I'm not having an affair, he said, and the exhaustion in his voice was so profound it made her chest ache. I'm not leaving you for someone else. I'm leaving because I don't know who I am anymore, and I can't figure it out while pretending everything is fine. Margaret wanted to scream at him. Wanted to throw something, cry, beg. But what came out was, so that's it. 23 years, and you're just done. Aren't you? He asked. The question hung between them. Because the truth, the terrible, honest truth, was that she'd been feeling it too. The slow suffocation of a life that had become routine instead of joyful. The mornings she woke up and felt nothing. Not sad, not happy. Just, empty. But she'd assumed this was what marriage became. That everyone felt this way eventually, and you just pushed through because that's what commitment meant. That night, David slept in the guest room. Margaret lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the last 5 years and wondering where they'd lost each other. She thought about calling her sister, but what would she even say? Over the next 2 weeks, they moved around each other like ghosts. Polite, distant, careful. David started looking for apartments in town, something temporary while he figured things out. Margaret told her assistant manager at the bookstore that she might need to take some time off, though she couldn't explain why. They told Emma and Tyler together on a Sunday afternoon video call. Both kids were shocked, then angry, then finally just sad. Tyler asked if this was about them, something they'd done. Emma cried and said she'd always thought her parents were the ones who'd make it. After the call ended, Margaret walked to their bedroom and stood in front of the full-length mirror. When had she stopped recognizing herself? The woman staring back looked tired. Not just physically, but in her bones. Like she'd been carrying something heavy for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to put it down. It was 2:47 a.m. on a Friday when everything changed. Margaret couldn't sleep, hadn't been sleeping well for weeks. She'd gotten up to make tea when she heard David's phone buzzing on the kitchen counter. He'd left it there, plugged in, when he went to bed in the guest room. She picked it up, not even thinking, and saw a text from a number she didn't recognize. Just wanted to check in. Hope you're doing okay with everything. Call me tomorrow if you need to talk. She stared at that message for a long moment. Then she did something she'd never done in 23 years of marriage. She opened his phone. She knew his passcode, it had always been Tyler's birthday, and scrolled through his messages. What she found made her legs weak. The number belonged to a therapist. Dr. Patricia Chen. David had been seeing her for 6 months. 6 months. The messages were brief, professional, mostly appointment confirmations. But Margaret scrolled up, reading, and found something from 3 weeks earlier. I appreciate you sharing that in our session today. Recognizing that you're struggling with depression is a significant first step. The feelings of emptiness and the desire to escape aren't about your marriage being broken, they're symptoms of something deeper that we need to address. Margaret sat down hard on the kitchen floor, phone still in her hand. Depression. David was depressed. And he hadn't told her. She kept scrolling, barely breathing, and found messages to his sister Kate from 2 months back. I don't know how to tell Margaret what's going on. She deserves better than this. Better than me feeling this way. The cabin in Colorado. I thought if I could just start over, be someone different, maybe I could fix what's broken. But Dr. Chen says I'm running from myself, not from her. I don't know what to do. The phone slipped from her fingers. All this time, she'd thought he was leaving because he didn't love her anymore. Because their marriage had failed. But he was trying to leave because he was drowning and didn't know how to ask for help. He thought he was protecting her by going. Margaret sat on that kitchen floor until her legs went numb, crying so quietly she could hear the refrigerator humming. When she finally stood up, she did something that would change everything. She deleted the notification of her opening his phone. She put it back exactly where she'd found it. And she made a decision. The next morning, over coffee, she looked at David across the table and said, I've been thinking. What if we go to Colorado together? He looked up, confused. What? That cabin you've been looking at. Let's go see it. Not to buy it. Just, to get away for a week. See what it feels like. Something flickered in his eyes. Fear maybe. Or hope. Margaret, I don't think that's, I'm not asking you to stay married to me, she interrupted, surprised by the strength in her own voice. I'm not asking you to fix anything. I just think if we're going to end this, we should at least try to remember who we were when we started. And maybe we both need to get away from this house, these routines, all of it. It was a lie. A calculated, desperate lie. She wasn't suggesting the trip because she thought they needed to remember the beginning. She was suggesting it because she'd seen those messages, understood what he was really running from, and knew that if he went to Colorado alone, he'd just be bringing his demons with him. But she couldn't tell him she'd invaded his privacy. Couldn't tell him she knew about the therapy, the depression, the real reason he wanted to leave. So she lied. And somehow, improbably, he said yes. They left for Colorado on a Wednesday morning in mid-October. The drive took 14 hours, split over 2 days, staying in a highway motel that smelled like stale coffee and cleaning products. They didn't talk much, but it wasn't the suffocating silence from before. It was something softer. Tentative. The cabin David had been looking at was small, perched on a hillside with pine trees pressing close on all sides. The real estate agent met them there, showed them around, then left them with the keys for the afternoon. Inside, it was simple. Wood floors, a stone fireplace, windows that framed the mountains like paintings. Margaret walked through the rooms while David stood by the fireplace, his hands in his pockets. It's nice, she said. Yeah. He didn't sound excited. He sounded tired. She turned to face him. David, why did you really want to come here? He was quiet for a long time. Then, I thought if I came to a place where nobody knew me, I could figure out how to be okay again. Okay with what? With myself. His voice broke on the last word. I wake up every morning and I don't recognize my life, Margaret. I don't recognize me. And I kept thinking if I could just start over somewhere new, maybe I'd feel like a person again instead of just going through motions. Margaret crossed the room and sat on the arm of the worn couch. Her heart was racing, but she kept her voice gentle. What if the problem isn't the place? What if it's that you're trying to do this alone? He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in months. I didn't want to drag you down with me. David, she said, and her own voice cracked now. I've been drowning too. I just didn't know how to tell you. And there it was. The truth she hadn't let herself say out loud. She'd been so focused on his pain, his leaving, that she hadn't acknowledged her own. That emptiness she felt, that invisible weight, maybe it wasn't just about their marriage. Maybe it was about her too. They spent 3 days in that cabin. Not as a couple trying to save their marriage, but as two people trying to remember how to be human. They hiked a trail that wound through aspen groves, the leaves gold and trembling in the wind. They sat on the cabin's small porch at sunset, wrapped in blankets, not talking but not needing to. David told her about the therapy, finally. Told her he'd been diagnosed with clinical depression 6 months earlier, that he'd been on medication but was struggling with the side effects, that he felt ashamed he couldn't just be happy when he had no reason not to be. Margaret told him about the night she'd seen his emails. She told him about reading his messages to the therapist, to his sister. She told him about the lie she told to get them here. I'm sorry, she whispered. I violated your privacy, and I lied to you, and thank you, he said. She looked at him, stunned. For lying. For caring enough to lie. For not letting me run. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. His palm was warm, familiar in a way that made her throat tight. I don't know if we can fix this, he said quietly. I don't know if I can fix me. Then maybe, Margaret said, we figure it out together. Not because we have to. Because we want to. On their last morning in Colorado, they stood outside the cabin as the sun rose over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that seemed too beautiful to be real. David didn't buy the property. They drove home together, stopping at diners and roadside attractions, taking the long way just because they could. When they got back, David moved his things out of the guest room. He also found a new therapist, one who specialized in couples counseling. Margaret started seeing someone too. Not because their marriage was broken, but because they both needed to understand themselves before they could understand each other. 6 months after that trip, on a spring afternoon when the bookstore was quiet, Margaret stood behind the register and thought about lies. The big ones and small ones. The ones we tell others and the ones we tell ourselves. She'd lied to David that morning at the kitchen table, suggested a trip she knew might save him without telling him why. And that lie had cracked something open between them. Not fixed it. Not magically solved everything. But created space for truth. David still struggled. Some days were harder than others. But he was fighting now, actively working on his mental health instead of running from it. And Margaret was learning that she'd been using her marriage as an excuse not to deal with her own emptiness, her own questions about who she'd become. They were still together. Still married. But it was different now. More honest. Less performative. They had date nights where they actually talked. They had hard conversations that didn't end in silence. They had moments of joy that felt earned rather than obligated. The lie that saved their marriage wasn't the one Margaret told that October morning. It was the lie they'd both been living for years, that everything was fine, that silence was the same as peace, that you could build a life without tending to your own soul. Breaking that lie open was the hardest, most necessary thing they'd ever done. So here's what I want you to think about. Have you ever told a lie that turned out to be the most honest thing you could have done? Have you ever looked at someone you love and realized you'd both been pretending? What would you have done in Margaret's position, respected privacy and watched someone you love disappear, or broken trust to save them? And here's the bigger question, when did we start believing that struggling means failing? That asking for help is weakness rather than courage? David thought leaving would fix him. Margaret thought staying silent would preserve their marriage. Both were wrong. But admitting that, facing it together, that's what saved them. Not a cabin in Colorado. Not a lie or a truth. Just two people deciding that drowning alone was worse than swimming together, even in rough water. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own relationships, your own struggles, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done? Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Share in the comments, your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if you stayed with us through this entire journey, thank you. Subscribe so you never miss our next story, because next time, we're exploring something even more unexpected, the day a woman found a letter addressed to her, written 30 years before she was born. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.